joined here today by Congressman Sarbanes, who, for those of you from, we have a good number of people here, Congressmen, who are from England who have joined us. This is, I think you know, a transatlantic forum of people who've been working on these issues on both sides of the pond. The UK went through a pretty dramatic transformation with the help of many of the people here in this room in its level of investment and focus in apprenticeships. And to those of you here, we are lucky to have a congressman who was born and raised very close by in our, his hometown was Baltimore, Maryland. And he's represented parts of Montgomery, Howard, Anne Arundel, and Baltimore counties since 2007 in the Congress. He sits on our House Energy and Commerce Committee, and during this week, National Apprenticeship Week, he is readying to introduce legislation that will bolster youth apprenticeship programs. And so he's here today to join with us to talk a little bit about apprenticeships in general, and particularly what's gotten him excited and the prospects he sees for youth apprenticeships in the new Congress. So Congressman, what we've been doing here today has been talking in particular about how do we get employers more involved in apprenticeships, how do we focus on apprenticeships in what some might call non-traditional industries, the industries that haven't always had apprenticeship programs in the past, like IT and healthcare and advanced manufacturing. And we're excited to have you with us to talk in particular about youth and sort of the next generation. And also whether or not there's an opportunity in the United States for policymakers in the period that we have ahead to continue to go forward. So I thought I'd just start by asking you a little bit about how you came to the issue of apprenticeships and what got you excited and what made you think this was a piece you wanted to move forward with.
Well, thanks, Sarah. Can you all hear me? Okay. I'll speak up a little bit. I think we're on different mic levels here.
That one might go up a little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
They're going to get you. She's got it over there.
Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I want to thank the Urban Institute for convening this group and convening on this topic. I think it's a real opportunity for us to focus on apprenticeships, and I'm particularly interested in this idea of youth apprenticeships. The work that the Urban Institute is doing to kind of put forward some of the research around this is very, very helpful to us in Congress as we look at sort of where to go with policy proposals. Speaking of our friends from England, I actually had the opportunity at one point to spend a semester at a high school in Oxford, and I remember that the 16 and 17 and 18-year-olds that I was with were coming out of their O-levels and looking at their A-levels and having to actually make some pretty long-term decisions at that particular juncture about what kind of career path they wanted to take. So I'm not surprised that some of the best examples of how you can do these apprenticeships and determine early on in somebody's career path what might be the best direction for them to go are coming from the UK. And of course there's other peer nations around the world that are doing this pretty well. What I am most impressed with, and we're trying to bring that idea to the design that we're looking at in terms of our legislation, is you really have to get employers to own this so that they are kind of pulling the apprenticeships through that pipeline rather than having schools that are trying to push it onto employers. And I worked for, well, 18 years as a volunteer, but then 8 years professionally with the Maryland State Department of Education, focused in Baltimore City, in particular at times on career and technology education. And so I understand what the various designs of apprenticeships can be. And I really think that the key element is that you get employers to be real stakeholders in this, to own it, to invest in it, to help design it, to pull students out of a school and onto a work site, understanding that the investment you make that way is going to be determinative of their success in terms of their careers and their skill set development and so forth. So we really want to focus in on the youth apprenticeship and bring that particular emphasis to the approach that we're taking.
And as I look at a summary of the bill that is still in development, but I think nearing, we'll see it soon, we hope, is big piece of the design is to try to bring the employers to the table. Do you want to describe how it works?
Yeah, because, I mean, you're going to have, what we envision is there will be a kind of interagency committee to evaluate proposals that come from the states, and this will be the Department of Labor, the Department of Education, Department of Commerce, so they'll each kind of have representatives to the evaluation piece. But what will make a proposal strong that's coming from a state is that they demonstrate the kind of partnering that includes employers in a way that, you know, is clearly emphasizing this idea of ownership. And so we think states will get, you know, will get the message that the best kinds of youth apprenticeship programs and systems that they can put in place are ones where they do the hard work of bringing employers in on the ground floor so they have that investment.
And they are you thinking about a way for them economically to incent the employers to come to the table?
Well, one of the things we want to do is give a tax credit. It'll be about $1,500 tax credit. That's not unusual. There are other proposals out there to provide employers with tax credits around workforce training and other kinds of investments. But again, that in combination with focusing on youth apprenticeships, which is this kind of age 16 to 24 area, or age band, I think that combination is what can help jumpstart the youth apprenticeships. A fair number of apprenticeships are happening a little bit further along on the career development, and in some instances end up being kind of remedial opportunities where maybe the traditional education path that somebody took wasn't sufficient, particularly when you look at some of these non-traditional subject matter areas like IT and health and so forth. And so you're coming in with an apprenticeship after someone's already gone and gotten the degree or the education that they thought was going to be preparing them, but the employer's looking at it and saying they're still not up to the standards we need. So then they put the apprenticeship in place. Better to design it from the front end so those skill sets are getting embedded early on in terms of the career path. That's a much more efficient way to go for the employers, for the market that's going to have these jobs, and obviously it makes more sense for the individual that's stepping into that opportunity.
One of the areas, obviously, in this country you know best is Baltimore. And that's a city that over the last few years has struggled with some of the divides that this country has had around, in particular, race, more profoundly than others, or at least those, maybe they express those divisions very profoundly in that city. Is there, as you think about this support for youth early and think about apprenticeship, do you have any thoughts about its potential as a healing tool?
Well, I think apprenticeships just broadly, because they they add to the set of opportunities that we want to make available to young people, wherever they live, whatever their background. If you're enhancing kind of the choices that are available to people to access a career path and become a meaningful contributing citizen to their community and their society, that's going to be a good thing. And creating economic opportunity, which at the end of the day is what we're doing here, absolutely has a healing effect in any community. You're particularly sensitized to that when you have situations of unrest and tension like we've experienced in Baltimore over the last couple of years in particular. So again, it kind of makes you think harder about what are the things that can bring communities together and empower them. And I think apprenticeships are just one additional but very important opportunity or tool in that toolkit of making a difference for communities.
One of the things we at the Urban Institute like to see in bills is a focus on evidence. You did build into the drafts that are circulating a discussion of data and information. What were you thinking in building that into the program?
Well, look, these days with most things you introduce, you know you're not going to, and it probably never makes sense to kind of create a whole system overnight that's going to be deployed everywhere, things you do in a kind of demonstration mode. And so one of the things around the data is on the front end, you want to be collecting what data is available in terms of the design elements, encouraging those as you create various criteria, and you also design kind of what the point systems are going to be for winning proposals. So you need research and data to help you just with that part of the process. But then you want to make sure that you're doing good evaluation on the back end. And you're collecting the data, and you're collecting it in a way that's informed by the kinds of research that already exists out there, the kind of research that the Urban Institute clearly helps to support in this area and more broadly. So it's a really important resource to have organizations like the Urban Institute that are focused on data, that are focused on best practices, so we're not just kind of guessing at these things. And I was just reading an article about charter schools where there appears to be emerging now some pretty good data as to which kinds of charter schools are working in the K-12 space and which are not. And that's incredibly valuable when you finally figure out what works and doesn't work, and there tends to be general consensus around that. So I think the data piece is really critical.
So we can bring evidence to the table, but at the end of the day, we also have to create a consensus around solutions to some of the problems that we've been talking about. What's your thoughts about the period ahead and the prospects for apprenticeships as a topic around which there may be bipartisan support? We heard Tom mention earlier that our incoming president at least is familiar with the apprenticeship concept and has maybe spread it more broadly in the public awareness than they have had in the past in a unique model. But anyway, more seriously, your thoughts about what the period ahead looks like for the capacity to find solutions across a wide array of issues, including apprenticeships.
I think there's potential for some bipartisan collaboration, and I think, actually, many of the components of what we're preparing to introduce harken back to a Republican-sponsored bill. Representative Goodling in 1992 put forward something focused on youth apprenticeships. So we've got some additional pieces in there, but this idea of focusing on apprenticeships and youth apprenticeships in particular is certainly one that one can expect will get support and backing and endorsement across the political spectrum, and we're going to work very hard to pursue that with my colleagues in terms of working with the next president. I think the fact that this is in the economic space, and it's about creating jobs, and in some way is about being receptive to the idea that there are a lot of different paths people can take to get to the jobs that can make them productive citizens and contribute to the society. I think that presents an opportunity, because I think what this election put a punctuation mark on is that people continue to be uneasy about their economic prospects. And if we could create in this country a really robust apprenticeship opportunity for millions of Americans, I think that would go a long way towards addressing some of that anxiety. And I'll just note that we put a lot of attention on the idea of four-year college in this country, and we should. And acquiring skill sets that way are very important. But it's not the only path to a good job. And frankly, in some instances, people can combine an apprenticeship approach with a college education as part of that career path. So we have to be open to all of these different ways of success, of achieving success. And I think that goes to a lot of what stirred people in this election. So we'll move forward with the expectation, hope, and anticipation that we can enlist people from all parts of the political spectrum in making this effort.
Well, we at the Urban Institute don't have a politics agenda, and we don't endorse legislation, but we are thrilled to have the chance to have the work that Bob and others in this room and elsewhere have done to inform the kind of ideas that you're bringing into the policy conversation. And we're just thrilled that you took a time out to just share that experience with the folks here. Thank you, Congressman.
Sure, I want to salute the Institute, and I also want to thank Bob because he's really done some good work, and we've turned to that to make ourselves informed as we're trying to create effective policy proposals here. So thank you all very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. So Bob, are you wrangling people to the next step?
Happy to be able to have a conversation with a bunch of businesses and policymakers. I'll first introduce the panel briefly. You have full bios in your packet. We have Will Holloway, and he is here representing the office of Senator Scott from South Carolina, who has been very active on the apprenticeship front. Let's see, we have Vicki from Crow Horwath. And Vicki is the lead of the practice that helps businesses identify the locations where they want to go and the incentives that would bring them to a particular location. We have Sarah, who is with J.P. Morgan Chase, and she is doing work in trying to, through the foundation, J.P. Morgan Chase, to try to improve workforce and education opportunities across the country. We have Paul Champion, who's with 3 AAA USA, which is an organization that is working in Maryland in particular to try to grow apprenticeships in a number of non-traditional areas, including IT. And we have Scott Cheney, who is here from the Help Committee. And the Senate Help Committee is involved in all kinds of issues around labor, medical research, higher education, And so certainly apprenticeship is part of the portfolio of the Help Committee. So, as the saying goes, money talks and you know what walks. And so I think of this as the Money Talks panel. So when you think about public policy, what you're really trying to figure out is, how can you use the levers of government to encourage behaviors that you think are good for society and discourage behaviors that you think are bad for society. And I think we're all in agreement that apprenticeship is something that's really good for society. And so this is really a discussion of the carrots and the sticks. Now, there are a few examples in the world of governments that use sticks. In other words, if you don't support apprentices, if you don't have apprentices, you have to pay a tax. But I think in most parts of the world, and certainly in the US, we're really talking about carrots. What are the incentives that we can bring to apprentices, to employers, to intermediaries, to related instruction providers so that they engage in apprenticeship? And for the past 50 years, I would say the Bugs Bunny share of carrots have really gone to higher education. And we've heard a lot of people talk about, the real push over the last decade in particular, that everybody should go to college. And I think in general, policymakers have realized that college isn't necessarily the best pathway for everyone and for every profession. And oftentimes when I say that, people will say to me, well, sure, you say that, but what about your own kids? Well, my own kid did an apprenticeship. I did an apprenticeship. My father did an apprenticeship. My brother-in-law did an apprenticeship. So I come from a long line of apprenticeships. I started my career as a nursing assistant, having done an apprenticeship while I was still in high school, so a youth apprenticeship. They called it cooperative ed in those days, but it was an apprenticeship. So, so we can learn from higher ed. Certainly higher education is an important part of apprenticeship, and we've heard that it's not an either-or proposition. But I think, this panel we want to talk about from the perspective of policymakers and companies, what are the carrots that we can put out there to really encourage companies? Because you oftentimes see everybody come to the table, intermediaries, apprentices, related instruction providers, but it can be difficult to get those businesses to the table. And so I think it's really important for us to figure out, how do we draw them in? So Scott, I'm going to start with you. So on the Help Committee, you obviously have competing priorities. You have funding for medical research and policies around medical research and around higher ed and around apprenticeship. So in balancing all those priorities, where do you think we have an opportunity, or what challenges are you thinking about, moving into a new Congress and thinking about, how do we move apprenticeship forward?
Great question, and thank you for inviting us here today. The benefit that we have working for Senator Murray is that she is both the ranking member of the Help Committee and of the Labor H Appropriations Subcommittee. So she does get a chance to really blend the policy development and the funding pieces. We have, I think, the additional benefit of being able to build off of some really strong work that the administration has done in putting out some money from some of their discretionary funds before we were able to actually appropriate money in order to help begin to demonstrate to employers who were not already doing apprenticeships how you could take advantage of apprenticeships and what they meant, and really how to move them into new industries. I think one of the biggest opportunities and one of the biggest upsides we have is to demonstrate that apprenticeships are a very effective model, not just in what had been the traditional industries in the US, but in any industry. Things that the European countries and others have known for forever, and that I think at one point we knew, but it had really fallen away into just some more traditional labor and trades kind of industries, manufacturing. So as we look at finding policies to support the continued economic recovery, really, we also have the ability to put some new appropriated money toward apprenticeships. So in addition to the money that the administration put out, we've been able to appropriate $90 million in the current fiscal year. We are hoping to button up the appropriations package for 2017, and we hope to have an additional tranche of money, either at least $90 million, we're hoping for a little bit more, And we've been lucky that we've had very strong bipartisan support, both on the policy side with senators like Senator Scott and Senator Collins and Senator Hatch, as well as Cantwell and Booker, and a really nice bipartisan mix on the Senate side. We just heard about the House doing some very good work, but also with Senator Blunt in supporting the appropriated money. So it has not really been a difficult lift for this work in getting there to be agreement about it being a good economic policy, but also an appropriate appropriation of money at this point.
That's great, and we are really fortunate that Senator Murray and Senator Scott are with us for another 6 years, and so we have champions of apprenticeship that will be with us for the next 6 years, which is great. So, Will, I want to turn to you. So Senator Scott's obviously active. South Carolina is a state that has been a real leader in the area of apprenticeship, and certainly Senator Scott has some great ideas about, how we can use tax incentives to bring companies. So if you want to talk a little bit about Senator Scott's ideas and the work your office is doing.
Sure. Yeah, he's really excited, I think, to work on this issue, and it's one that hits very close to him, for him. Obviously, hearing about the Apprenticeship Carolina people, the good work that they do is I think, inspiring for him to see the type of practical impact that apprenticeships can have on the workforce in the state. So within that realm, he has introduced a bill that would, pretty simple, it would provide a new federal tax credit for employers who want to hire apprentices. So it would be $1,500 for an apprentice who's participating in a registered apprenticeship or one authorized by the state apprenticeship agency. It would be $1,500 for anybody under 25, and then $1,000 for any apprentice above the age of 25. From what we've heard, I think in seeing in South Carolina with the local state tax credit there, it's been a productive incentive to encourage more employers to participate and expand their kind of thoughts and look towards utilizing apprentices as employees more so than were it not there. So.
That's great, and it sounds like, having just heard from Congressman Sarbanes, that not only do we have bipartisan support, but it sounds like we have bicameral support. So what a great thing that is, right? I mean, so it's great that people are rallying around apprenticeship from, both sides of the aisle, both sides of the Capitol, and so I think we have real opportunities. Sarah, I want to turn to you, because certainly government funding is important in expanding apprenticeship, but the idea of public-private partnerships are also important. So, tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing and through the JP Chase Foundation to support apprenticeships and to move the concept of apprenticeship forward.
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, Bob and Tom, thank you so much for organizing this. This has been a really rich and inspiring conversation, and I'm probably not the only person in this room who's been feeling a little down over the past week, and I think this has been a pretty uplifting conversation, because one of the reasons probably most of us are in this line of work is because we want to create economic opportunity for all people, and we really see that the education and training system in general, and apprenticeships in particular, are one way that we can create a pathway for people to move into economically sustaining jobs and really have a place in our society. And so it is reassuring to be here with so many smart people who are really doing innovative, smart work on this and promoting this topic, and just to see how packed this room was, less so right now, but more so earlier today. And the education and training system is one part of promoting inclusive growth, and we need to focus on a lot of other things too. But I think there's a lot of promise here for things that we can accomplish in terms of promoting an education and training system that creates those opportunities. At JP Chase, this has been a big priority for us for several years, and we've really expanded our work around apprenticeship in particular over the past year, and we're doing this in a number of ways. So I sit at the foundation, so we have a number of philanthropic investments that are really focused on developing, supporting training providers, developing kind of employer partnerships to really have that effective employer engagement, and also, developing systems around apprenticeships. So I think that's one of the things that keeps coming up, is that we, in the U.S., one of the things we lack is really a sort of a strong infrastructure around apprenticeships. So, the technical assistance and the peer learning, and the research to really support a strong apprenticeship system. So we're doing that, but we're also working as an employer too. And so we have developed an apprenticeship program in technology here in the U.S. that we are launching possibly this week. So we're pretty excited about that from the employer perspective. And then, also as as the world's largest financial services firm, we have obviously incredible global reach, and so we're doing a lot of work to really bring people together around things that we're learning around apprenticeships that we're supporting in Germany and France, in the UK, and so we've joined the Global Apprenticeship Network, and we're really working to kind of leverage that so we can learn across countries. So this transatlantic forum is particularly well suited for that.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for transitioning us. We've pivoted now to the employer's perspective. So, Vicki, I want to turn to you. What does it take to engage an employer? So we've heard today, conversations in South Carolina about, well, what does it cost you to not train individuals? We've heard about return on investment, $1.47 for every dollar in, you get $1.47 out. But and I've heard people say that they, by having employees engaged in apprenticeship, employee retention goes up, employee loyalty. But from an employer's perspective, what does it take? What does it take to get that CEO, that CFO, to say, okay, we're going to invest in this?
Right, so that's the $1 million question,
Yeah.
right? So I'll just share from my perspective in my 25-year career of helping companies locate both people, assets, facilities in the U.S. The one thing I've learned is that companies have very similar characteristics to individual people, meaning that they all look at it a little bit differently. There are some common threads that they all kind of rally around when they're looking at what they're doing from an expansion perspective or keeping their operations running, and that I think that's the talent pool, the skill sets they're looking for, those things all marry in. But really it's understanding what each individual company is looking for and what's gonna trip their trigger and make them move forward with it. And on both panels there were folks that were talking a little bit about that. It's the ability to hear their needs, understand what those needs are, and then essentially educate them on why putting an apprenticeship program into place is not only going to support their current needs, but take them into the future with needs they don't even know they have yet. And I think that's a key. Around the funding part, though, that's kind of a common thread that I see with all of my clients is, especially in the area of skill set development. So a lot of companies, even large Fortune 100 companies, don't by plant necessarily have a training budget. And so when they hear the words about apprenticeship program, customized training, and alike, their focus is, well, how much is this going to cost me? And I think the response that Carla talked about was a really good one, which is, well, what would it cost you if you don't do it? And I think that's a key.
It is. So, Paul, I'm going to turn to you because Paul is sort of where the rubber hits the road. So Paul is working hard in the state of Maryland to try to engage employers in apprenticeships. And so he is speaking with employers on a daily basis, but also has the unique perspective, having worked in the UK for so long, has spoken to employers in a country where apprenticeship is fairly well known, and now in the U.S. we're maybe less well known. So, Paul, what are your thoughts? What are you hearing as you meet with employers? What intrigues them about apprenticeship, and what do you think holds them back? And based on that, what kinds of policy levers could we use to push them over the edge to join in?
Thanks, Diane. I think just a couple of apologies first. The first one to my UK colleagues. having been in Maryland for the past 6 months, they might not understand my strong Baltimore accent. So I just want to apologize for that.
When you call everybody hun, we'll know, right?
Yeah. And secondly,
I'm from Baltimore, I get to make that
if a
joke.
big smile comes on my face, it's because after 5 months this morning we got our apprenticeship standards registered with Maryland Apprenticeship Council in IT, digital and social media, and cybersecurity. So we actually have put the rubber on the ground today. I think one of the things is I see you've done in the UK when we have conferences, we do exactly the same. We leave the money talk right till the last in the hope that people will stay, because people think they're going to find out how to get more, and employers in particular. I noticed that there's a lot of people left, so you have to ask the question: is the money thing actually the key thing that's driving people in apprenticeships? And if I just give you an example, is that we talked to a big IT company in Maryland, who last Thursday was going to take 5 apprentices. We'd had the CEO, the president's go ahead. He then passed it down to his VPs, and they were looking at the departments of which jobs they were going to put it in. We went to sort of finalize the trainer needs analysis and the job descriptions to bring them away to start advertising it, and all of the VPs had decided not to go with it. And it wasn't a cash issue, it was a perception issue. It was they take interns, why should we take apprentices, so the money aspect was an issue, and I would warn against focusing on how are we going to lever more cash into getting this going, because in the UK that's what we've had, and we found out that that's not sustainable. So we're making that shift in the UK. But in Maryland, we have an actual fund in Maryland that will give employers 50% of their tuition fees back after they've had an employee there for 6 months. And it's incredible how many times we talk about that, and it's one sheet of paper on one A4 that the employer has to fill out, and we can fill it out for them, we can't submit it for them, but they just don't want to do it. So what am I coming up against? I'm coming up against, to a certain degree, in Baltimore, that funding isn't the issue. I think the issue is that we have in the US, you have a strong traditional apprenticeship, and everybody knows the value and the feeling of what that is. When you go into non-traditional apprenticeships, they have a feeling of 4-year degrees and internships, and they understand that. It's difficult to get people to drift into understand apprenticeships, but we are breaking those down. I mean, currently we've got 17 vacancies in IT and in cybersecurity. We've got two big alliances, cybersecurity alliances, that have signed up with us last week, who are too big. They have 6 or 7 employers in each, who are all wanting to work with us to develop part of our cyber apprenticeship and take it further on, because they don't want the hassle of that. They want, and I think Kim mentioned that earlier on, they want somebody to give them a hand. So it's a strange one to have, because I'm not finding that the cash is the issue, because when we go to employers, there is 40% of people who are not given good training in the first year leave the job. And even if you look at an entry-level position, it can cost between 30 and 50% of that salary to recruit. So if you put your tuition fees in that 30 to 50% of the entry-level qualification, $48,000, then it's never going to be an issue, the money. And we're not getting turned away because of cash. We're getting turned away because people don't quite grasp why in a non-traditional occupation is an apprentice going to be effective. I think that's what we're butting up against.
Did you have something to say?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on what Paul said, because I think that's an incredibly important insight. And I apologize, I was not here for the rest of the day, so this may have been said ad infinitum. I really do think that 2 things. One, we're facing more a perception, awareness, understanding issue than almost anything. And 2, and I'm going to come back to that, 2, I know you didn't intend this, but I just want to make sure it's really clear. When we talk about the government money versus the private money, we, Senator Murray, and all of the supporters of the EARNS Act, and then the 2 separate in the Senate tax credit bills, I don't think have any intention, have never thought about making apprenticeship a federal or a government program. It is, at its core, a sponsor-owned program. That could be an employer or someone else, and all of the partners they have. And then for an apprenticeship to survive and succeed and sustain, that's what it has to be. All we see is such a lack of understanding and a lack of infrastructure that Sarah was talking about, that we hope to create that economic incentive to pull people into at least asking them the question, as they've done so well in South Carolina, what is this thing? And how do I do it? And I get a tax credit for it? That's great. And we believe that that's great, and we believe there needs to be more awareness and infrastructure. But ultimately, this has to be an employer, sponsor owned. We're just trying to help seed the field a little bit more in order to pull more people in, because we do think there's such a public and private return to it.
So I think, go ahead.
I just want to comment on something on that. So again, from someone who works directly with the companies and sits with the CEOs and CFOs, I would tell you that I totally agree that you're right. There's a perception issue, because we've had in this country for a long time this concept of customized training, and everybody's kind of adapted to that. They get what that is. They're having a hard time articulating for themselves what's the difference between customized training and apprenticeship, which is our job as providers of that service, or representatives of that, to be able to articulate for them what the difference is. And quite frankly, if we can't articulate the difference, then they shouldn't do it. That's my opinion on that. As far as the funding goes, though, it's really interesting, because coming out of the customized training era, and merging over into the apprenticeship era, there are federal funds, state funds, local funds, and even special interest funds that are out there that can be brought to the table to help construct the program for the companies. And I will tell you for a fact that the folks that I talk to, my clients, are very interested in that piece of it. I think, to your point though, once they do it, I think then they get why they're doing it. But I think to get them interested in doing it, I do feel like there needs to be some incentive there. So
That's exactly what we're trying to do.
I see both of you. So Paul, if you want to add in, and Sarah?
Could I just say, don't underestimate the fact that as a society in the US, you come from you have an opinion that it's worth investing in education, and you will pay dollars for that. And I think if you're talking about funding levers, I remember something that because I was here a year ago with Tom and the rest of the guys, Tom played a video, and I think it was at university in Baltimore, which was a UK government video called, I think it was Go and Get Forward. Yeah, and in the UK it was £80 million they had spent on that campaign. You know, if you're gonna put federal dollars into apprenticeships, put it into something that shows, tells, and makes people feel what an apprenticeship is. You know, because you're right, it has to be owned by the employer. It can't be a state-funded program.
And Sarah?
Yeah, so, I mean, on this question of funding, so, one of the things I've learned is that large employers are already spending money training their workers, and the challenge that we really see is with the small and medium-sized employers that lack those resources, and also with, how much are we actually directing these private dollars towards training towards the lower and middle skilled workers, as opposed to towards the higher skilled bachelor's degree executive workers. I agree that some of the non-traditional apprenticeships, part of it is this perception issue. I think the funding can be helpful, though, when it comes to particularly working with small and medium-sized employers. So, Jerry at Vermont High Tech talked about working with Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, which is a huge employer, but he also works with a lot of small and medium-sized employers. And by having an intermediary like that, you can really bring together small and medium-sized employers. So that's one place where funding can make a difference. And when it comes to that, like reputation, sort of understanding of what an apprenticeship in a non-traditional occupation means, I think that's also where funding can come in, and that's where we think about directing our foundation dollars, is really towards the research and setting up organizations that can develop common standards across an industry for what apprenticeships in different occupations mean. Do they incorporate industry recognized credentials? Like, is there some sort of, can we create these, employer-led sector partnerships that really develop the apprenticeship standards so that there is a common understanding of what these apprenticeships mean in different occupations?
So, so we think about using federal funding as an incentive to bring businesses to the table. But, what I hear you all saying is that, maybe the bigger issue is perception, and it's the perception of employers, it's the perception of parents. And, this is going to seem very trite, but I remember when I decided to do an apprenticeship, my high school principal tried to talk me out of it. And, my friends' parents were, all upset because, they thought I was going to go to college and, what am I doing? And
Throwing your life away.
Yeah, and then it came to, we graduated and everybody went to the beach for senior week, and I was there on paid vacation because I had a full-time job with benefits, and it was interesting, and that job paid my way through college as well. So once I think people connect that, on one hand you could have debt, on the other hand you could have, paid vacation. But how can we use maybe some federal funding or the levers of policy, to influence parents? So, the Census Bureau did the projection of earned income, 7-8 years ago, and everybody knows the line, right? Go to college and you'll have $1 million more in added income. And what everybody forgets is the asterisk in that report that says, well, but it depends. Not if you do this job or this job, but maybe if you do this job or that job. And unfortunately, in those kinds of reports, we tend to put college in one bucket and non-college in another bucket, and we don't differentiate between non-college trained skilled and non-college unskilled. So how can we get to the point where we have every parent in America that knows, well, it's not just college that adds maybe $1 million in earned income, but having a skill, being able to do something and produce something. So, I throw that out there. Is there something that we can do from state policy, federal policy, to really help drive the change in perception about the role of apprenticeship?
I'd just like to say that with everything that's gone on in the last week and some of the concerns that I think a lot of us have about the direction we're going on the federal side of government, I think it also presents a very real opportunity for us, because the vote went the way it went, in my opinion, because a lot of people are hurting and they're economically having issues. And as someone who helps companies locate, it is incumbent upon us as individuals to be skilled and trained such that those companies can be here and employ people to do the jobs they need them to do. And we've got this very strong dichotomy of an aging workforce combined with a gap, and then the millennial generation. And what those workforces look for, what they want, what drives them are completely different. And so I think there's an opportunity now to educate, to get people educated. I think what everybody in this room is doing is tremendous. And everyone who's not here but are involved with apprenticeships, it's the right time to be doing this. And so I'm optimistic that we're going to get companies to understand and to see and to embrace it, and maybe help the healing of the people that are hurting economically. So that's my 2 cents.
So I think at this point I want to ask if there are people who are dialed in if they have questions, or folks in the room. So let's get to your questions. Let's wait for the microphone. So the gentleman there.
Hi there, my name is David Adler. I'm affiliated with something called the CFA Institute, which is about investing, and there's an investment lever right now that no one yet has mentioned, and that is something called ESG investing, environmental social governance. It's sort of a current iteration of what used to be called a social impact, responsible investing, value investing, but the most advanced area of ESG concerns S, which stands for social, meaning there's a huge interest in companies that have socially engaged employees and are doing something to engage their employees, and apprenticeships fits quite nicely into an S framework. So given there's this sort of fad, shall we say, about ESG investing, I'm wondering who out there is actually going to interact with ESG type analysts on Wall Street or high net worth investors to start attracting ESG dollars, and also change the perception from a CEO perspective. This is actually a positive thing because it changes the company's ESG score.
That's a good point, and we have companies that are considering becoming a public benefit corporation, and certainly participating in an apprenticeship, would satisfy the public benefit requirements as well. So, are you aware of?
Yeah, so I can speak to this because we work very closely with our ESG folks, and I think there's a really interesting analogy. One of the challenges is that there is no one sort of common set of metrics for evaluating employer investment in human capital broadly. So some of these ESG reporting tools are starting to develop them, but they're not super advanced. And I think that example of what has happened with environmental policies and practices is a really interesting thing to think about in terms of human capital. So could we develop a set of metrics by which companies report out their various policies and practices on human capital? And that's something that we've been thinking about very much and are hoping to make some investments in.
Great point. Another question, yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Marquita Friday. I'm at the Maryland State Department of Education, and I work in the area of career and technology education. I have one comment and one question. The comment was about this perception in terms of how can we change this perception. One of the things that we try to do very proactively is talk about post-secondary education as opposed to college. And post-secondary education is apprenticeship, it is college, it is military, so it combines all of that. It's 2-year and 4-year. So just getting away from the terminology of college and then everything else is out there. It's really post-secondary education, and it encompasses all of that. So that was just a comment. The question is, and specifically refers to some of the legislation that is potentially coming out. You talk a lot about incentives for employers, but in terms of youth apprenticeships, and that's one of the things that we're trying to really get underway in Maryland, are youth apprenticeships. One of the things that I hear from employers as a barrier or a stumbling block is about the liability and insurance. They don't want to take particularly 16 and 17-year-olds because of the liability factor. Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to know, was there anything in the legislation that addresses what employers see as the barrier, not just the incentives for wanting to take specifically youth employers, but what are the barriers that keep them from taking youth apprentices?
So,
good point.
So a couple of thoughts. One, just on the awareness piece, the legislation that Senator Murray and Senator Scott and Hatch and others are supporting does have some funding to put into awareness for parents and educators and students and employers and guidance counselors, critically guidance counselors, because they have such a key role to play, so that they are more aware of the value of apprenticeships. On the post-secondary, one of the terms that we're using in federal legislation more often now is a recognized post-secondary credential, which is a 2 or 4 year degree, an apprenticeship, an industry-recognized credential or certificate of certification or a license, so that we really do try and broaden that out. That's all well and good in legislation, but it has to be then translated into actual use day-to-day in schools and every place else. And then finally, what was the question? Liability. We actually have tried to look into that and what might be a national framework, but because so much of this is state-driven, trying to come up with, in a piece of federal legislation, what a solution would be, we've not been able to find the right approach that would satisfy anyone, let alone everyone. And so I don't have an answer, and I really think this is probably going to need to be something that every state, as this system evolves, every state's going to have to come up with their own answer, and hopefully states are working with each other and looking at best practices and models. But this really does come down to all sorts of questions about, the liability costs that employers are willing to spend and pay and be responsible for, and that's going to vary state to state according to the individual state's business culture and practice.
Yeah, the sense that I've heard, and I don't want to put Carl on the spot, maybe Will can speak to this too, but in South Carolina there have been a number of youth apprenticeships, and I'm curious to know how you've kind of dealt with this liability issue in South Carolina. Because the sense I get is that it ended up not being a huge challenge, but maybe I'm wrong. Yeah.
Please.
I have the mic for Carla. Thanks.
Yes, one of the questions that we do hear quite frequently from companies who are interested in youth apprenticeship is who picks up that workman's comp piece.
Right. Yep.
And several years ago, South Carolina passed the Education and Economic Development Act. And as part of that act, it gave school districts the authority to pick up the workman's comp for work-based learning programs. And apprenticeship oftentimes falls under that umbrella. So a lot of our school districts actually pick up the workman's comp piece for work-based learning programs.
It's interesting. You know, and I think
And it makes a difference.
Yeah.
It really
would make
does.
a huge
Sure.
difference, right,
Yeah.
to sort of have that risk share. And, you know, on the issue of public perception, I think, you know, one of the things that I've thought about for a long time is, you know, the blue ribbon schools. So I think that the motivations with the blue ribbon school program, you know, how many kids can you get to college? You know, that drives principals. And so, you know, what if we tweak the blue ribbon schools so it's not just how many kids can you get to college, but how many kids can you get, you know, to have a work credential, or, you know, to have an apprenticeship, or to get a job, you know, as they get out of school. So that might be another place to, you know, I think if principals were, you know, being rewarded for individuals who do an apprenticeship in high school, they, you know, they may spend a little more time and energy with guidance counselors and employers trying to facilitate that. So, you know, that could be helpful as well. Yes?
Thank you. I just had a question with respect to tailoring legislation, or perhaps tailoring tax credits. We've seen in the last election places maybe like Toledo, or places like Milwaukee or Reading, Pennsylvania. Those places are suffering. They are lacking jobs, and people there are angry. And you would think apprenticeships would be a good opportunity if there were sufficient incentives for employers, for community colleges, for intermediaries to set up networks in those areas. That might give a boost to the areas that perhaps are in most dire straits, so the post-industrial Rust Belt cities. Just was interested if anybody here has thought about legislative options to target areas like that within the country.
I mean, I think it's a good point. Our bill didn't specifically target it just because we wanted to keep it relatively simple and keep it as open to as many employers as possible. But you know, it could be something to think about if we notice any traction on this or any other tax credit or on the other bill.
Just to offer, there are overlaid programs right now that are in existence that do target some of the areas you're talking about, and I think it's a great point. What we're doing is we're looking at how to utilize existing grant programs that do target special areas and zones, a lot of them being in the Rust Belt regions, and utilizing those monies to help create these apprenticeship programs. So I think it's a really good point, and it's about taking what we have already in place and figuring out how to utilize it to the best and highest good, and then as new things come online, how they counter that.
I think just fundamentally, you know, apprenticeships don't create jobs; they help fill jobs. So this has to be something that, for that kind of a purpose, has to be paired with a really targeted economic development that can be put. Then you target it to high-need regions or areas with high unemployment, long-term kind of economic distress, whatever we term it. But hoping that apprenticeships or any sort of an education model is going to fix a region's economic woes is not quite meeting the reality. You have to also pair it with other things so that you fundamentally help to rebuild a broken economy. So this is certainly part of it.
Do you have a question or a comment? Both. Okay, great.
At risk of sounding a little bit unpopular here, and really I'm interested in your thoughts on this, Paul. We had this thing called the age grant, didn't we?
Yep.
And personally, I can't stand it. I found it a real red herring. I feel that, generally speaking, people value things that cost money. they fixate on the deficit. If they feel they're having to be incentivised too strongly for something, there must be something wrong with it.
Yep.
We had nothing but problems with this. And it was a similar kind of model by the sounds of it. And I'm really glad to be away from it now, because in fact, we stopped offering it to people unless they asked us, because it was just too much hassle. Because what we want to focus on is the benefits rather than the negative side of it. And we don't want to, the mindset you're trying to encourage is a positive one, rather than, oh, you need help all the time around it. Don't know what you think.
Yeah.
Also, sorry, you haven't mentioned the levy, which I'm quite surprised at.
What levy? I'm in the US now. I don't need to mention the levy. Thank goodness.
We call it a tax.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I think you're right. I think it takes me back when I was in my late teens, which was not that long ago. I read a book by Victor Khayyam, who, remember, he bought the Remington microscope. I like the razor that much that I bought it. What people tend not to know is that after he bought it, sales just went through the floor. And everybody was saying, what you've got to do is you've got to sell these razors cheaper. And he went to the board meeting and says, no, we're going to double the price. And then sales went through the roof. And I think, I don't know why that's one thing I remember. It doesn't mean that I charge double for everything that I do, by the way. but it did resonate with me. It did resonate with me, and I think you're right. I think yeah, people have to see the value in apprenticeships, not in the value of the money they're going to get back for doing it. And I think that's a clear thing. I think just one thing on the state system. In the UK, when the government make a law, everybody in the UK has to do it. When somebody makes a funding decision, everybody that delivers apprenticeships has to deal with it. So in America, it's a bit of a pleasure and pain syndrome for the state system, in that I can register apprenticeships in Maryland, but probably not deliver them in California. Do you know what I mean? But that, in your question around what can you do in Pennsylvania and all of those states where there is a pain and they've voted in that way, is that because the state system is so diverse, you can have different mechanisms of funding and handling the apprenticeship market. And I think that's an advantage. And I think as a nation, you've got to see the strength in that. And if you link that with the strength of the value that you guys put on education, and make apprenticeships an education route, rather than something that is seen. You don't want to drive it down the route that we have done in the UK, but we're getting out of that now, where it's the last resort for some people, or it's for those kids that are in the inner city because they can't go to college because their parents can't afford it or they can't get the funding to do it. It's got to start from a parity level if you can, and work up from that. If it's part of the education system, then at the end of the day, people will value it, they'll go on board with it. And I haven't had any parent, we try to involve the parents in all the discussions that we have. I haven't had any parent question the viability of an apprenticeship when you say your son, your daughter is going to work in this IT company and get $25,000 starting, and when they finish in a year's time, they're going to be on $40,000. Nobody can argue with money in the back pocket. And I think that's the money you need to focus on, not the cash you're going to get for delivering it.
And that's actually, I think apprenticeships are at a really interesting opportunity and a really interesting moment in the U.S. economy right now. I think even before this election, there had begun to be a trend back to trying to figure out how do you reestablish that employer-employee compact. We'd gotten too far away from the, toward the economy of one, and I'm just going to make all of you fungible, and I'm going to take whoever comes in the door. That having that loyalty, having some longevity and persistence in employment actually has returns to both the employer and the employee, and both sides are beginning to come back to realize that. I think this election is probably going to double down on that a little bit, but I also think that we have the benefit of now being able to say that apprenticeships are, and this is out of no disrespect, okay? It's not just for the bricklayer or the welder or the carpenter, right? Because that's what they was only seen as. But now there's Microsoft and the companies in Maryland, and I am very excited about the Washington Technology Industries Association is setting up an apprenticeship where they're now going to try and be the IT apprentice provider across multiple states and multiple companies, because IT is so prevalent in so many industries, right? That we are now having a chance to throw back the curtain to show that apprenticeships are appropriate in healthcare, and IT and finance and so many other places that you have a chance to say to parents and students, wow, I did not know that I could use this there. So slightly different than where the UK probably is. We have, I think, a lot of things that are coming together at almost exactly the right time through no intentional design, but damn it, let's grab a hold of this thing and really make it work.
And to your point, Scott,
Unintentional design.
All right, well, we're all following Sarah's plan. We just didn't know it.
You know, to your point, I mean, and clearly you meant no disrespect, but one of the things that makes me laugh is, sometimes when my sister and her husband own a plumbing company, and when I drive into their shishi neighborhood of 5-acre horse farms, what I see is the bricklayer, the electrician,
Absolutely.
the plumber, right?
Yeah.
You know, and not the professors necessarily, right? So I think that. If people just get in their car and drive and are a little more open-minded, they would see that, there are lots of pathways to economic security, and we just need to get those. And so, hopefully when BLS does these, synthetic projections in the future, they will separate out non-skilled, non-college work from skilled non-college, because I think that would really help people understand that there are many skilled trades that will pay far more than, a college job.
Yep.
So.
Absolutely.
And I want to remind people that there are other panelists from the other panels, so as you have questions, feel free, this panel or anybody else who spoke today. Yes? Wait for the microphone, please. Thanks. And also, who's keeping track of viewers that are somebody? Oh, okay, perfect. All right.
Angela Middleton Murray. We've been delivering apprenticeships primarily 16 to 18-year-olds in the UK for about 6 years, and I think this has been fascinating for me and really, really encouraging, because there's no sort of objection or issue that I've heard today that we've not come across in the UK, and every single one of them has been, manageable, and we've managed to get around it and over it. And what I'm sort of not sure of is how many organisations there are, such as Carla's organisation, because I think what you really need is a sort of an infrastructure to push this forward, because I don't think that employers don't want to do it, but it is a big communication piece, and there's lots of discussions need to take place, and discussions around methods of overcoming all of these objections. And then what you find is they dip their toe in the water, they see it works, and then they embrace it. The same with parents, the same with young people. They see their peers going into an apprenticeship, and then they start to follow suit. And I think what really needs to take place now is to pull together an infrastructure of sort of training providers. I don't know if you already have that, because training providers in the UK don't just deliver apprenticeships, they very much sell the concept, communicate the concept, and that is quite a slow burn and quite a lengthy sales process, but you usually find that you get repeat business once that takes place. So that's really sort of a comment and a question. What is that infrastructure? In the UK, we have a register of approved providers, and I don't think there's any surprise. Obviously, the work that Carla does is excellent, but I think she's been focusing on it, and her team has been focusing, and that's probably why they've ended up with 811 apprentices.
So I think the Department of Labor has recognized that, and a significant part of the investment with the dollars that the Secretary appropriated or made available to this, as well as the dollars that Congress appropriated to the effort, has been around building that infrastructure. So, I think to the credit of the Department of Labor, they really saw the value in this moment of time and energy to start creating that infrastructure. I think with the belief that if you do create the infrastructure and you get businesses involved, it will be self-perpetuating. So I think the Department of Labor's tried to do a great job with that. Tom, did you have a comment?
Yes, please, Donna. I was just going to build on that point from Angela, because on the panel it's come up several times about, well, what is the role of government? Very clear, it's not about trying to top down prescribe what an apprenticeship model is. And I think, as Angela just said, the government in the UK, across the UK, has taken the view that it is there to try and incentivise and support the apprenticeship ecosystem. So, that sort of 38,000 feet marketing message is something actually that the government takes responsibility for. Paul, you mentioned the £18 million they spent on prime time ads last year. I got news for they spent £24 million this year, and actually with the wonders of technology and the team in the sandbox over there, they might just be able to play the latest get in, go far, 30-second ad, paid for by Her Majesty's government, but is there to support employers, apprentices, and parents make the right choice. So hopefully they're able to queue that up, because we've got access to the internet here at Urban, and just play that in a few seconds. So I'll just filibuster like you do in Congress, for the next half an hour. That's
While
okay.
they're pulling that up, we had another
but,
question.
Let's get another question.
Yes, wait.
Hi, this is Laura Chen, but I'm working with the Healthcare Career Advancement Program. And one of the things we haven't talked a little bit about, but maybe not enough about, is also the excitement about human capital development with low-wage workers moving up within an organization. And it's very important in healthcare. I think some of the most excitement that we've gotten from employers is we've begun to do some work on building some national standards and national programs, is folks within the healthcare institutions who say, Mary Smith over here is so talented and can be such a contributor. How can we move her forward when she is a single mother working 2 jobs? Can we put her into an apprenticeship program so that we can get the benefit of the talent that she already has given us? And I think that's something to really think about, as well as taking a look, and this is a sort of an appeal to the colleges as well. How do we build competency-based assessments that also transfer so that people are getting credit for what they already know? The value of an apprenticeship is that you can do that. In healthcare, we need to align that with the college system, because for the long-term value, that has to translate into college credits. It's starting to happen. It needs to happen a lot more. And I'm certainly interested in other folks who are looking at that question and have some solutions there. I think we can do a lot more together on that.
I agree. We're working on a project here with Department of Labor funding to develop competency-based standards. I know you're working on projects to develop competency-based standards. And coming from the higher ed world, where I spent 30 years, I think those competency-based standards are very helpful, because when you take them to a college and they get reviewed for prior learning assessment, it's much easier to align, the competencies with a syllabus to say, check, 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 we're going to give credit. So I think that is how we move in the right direction, is it's not just a number of hours that you spent, but the college now can see what you did and what you're competent. So I think that'll help. Jim, did you have?
Just wanted to say
Department of Labor.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, a previous study that Bob did was, 97% of apprenticeship sponsors, highly value apprenticeship and would recommend it to other employers. And we found, I can remember speaking at an AHEMA conference, and there was somebody from UPS there. And I said, come on, speak to these folks and talk to them about it. And they were so engaging. So, when you talk about peer-to-peer, business-to-business, I think that those were our best, selling points. So, and I did want to just mention that we are releasing an ROI study this week, Department of Commerce, so keep your eyes open for that.
That's great. And I think we've teed up the video paid for by Her Majesty, so let's take a look.
These young people are at the most exciting time of their lives.
I'm ready for work, I'm ready to go.
Making their mark as apprentices.
My first day, I'm so nervous.
Like them, you can get the skills to go far.
It really makes me happy to see how confident you've become.
You could even get a degree.
I know what I want to do now, and I'm really, really happy.
And get paid.
Let's get this.
Find out how an apprenticeship can work for you at getandgofar.gov.uk.
It's great.
Great. You see the enthusiasm.
Can we just steal that?
Yeah,
actually, I don't know if we need to. Yeah.
I'll overdo it with my Baltimore accent.
That's right. That's a great commercial.
Yes, we have another question.
Sort of a question and comment. You mentioned earlier something about reports where they show that people with college degrees get so much money and people with...
Oh, the Census Bureau report,
yes.
Yeah.
Well, one of the misleading things I think in that is they have not accounted for the cost of going to college. It seems to me that you should subtract the expense or the present value of the expense of going to college before you make such a comparison. Do you have any data on that?
Well, that number came out quite a number of years ago, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. I think when the expense was lower and
Right.
fewer people were relying on loans, but
Right.
Calculate how much interest you pay in your income-based repayment plan, plus your tuition, and right. I mean, if you're doing an all-in count, so I think it is time to go back and look at those numbers with an all-in count, as well as looking not just saying college versus non-college.
And luckily, we have now better ability to break out that non-college. There's a lot of work being done at Department of Ed about how do you actually know if it's non-college but an apprenticeship or a credential or a certificate. So we're getting better. We will have more and more better information about if you're less than college, what exactly you may have.
Yeah, and one of the things a project that we're working on, which is not finalized yet, so consider this your sneak preview, but it'll be basically an interactive website that's a directory of good jobs that don't require a bachelor's degree. So you'll be able to kind of break it down by different slices like occupation and sector and geography, city and state, and really kind of drill down into sort of interesting trends in this kind of middle skilled job space.
That's great for people to be able to have access to that information. Oh, okay, yeah. All right. We have one more question up here.
Hi, Gary Seshagiri with Ishpi, who's a defense contractor, and I was going to ask a question about, as the largest buyer of cybersecurity services, if the government were to incentivize contracting companies who do most of the work, particularly in software development, for instance, which is what we do, from a procurement point of view, if you were to do preferential treatment for contractors that actually do provide skills to women, minorities, and veterans and so on through an apprenticeship mechanism, I think you would probably drive a lot of good behavior towards apprenticeships, much more so than a $1,500 or $2,000 tax credit, because I'm telling employers that we need to invest $25,000 to $30,000 in each apprentice. It still is cost effective, so the $1,500 may not be much of an incentive. Whereas on the other hand, if I can get a 5-year contract, and I can create hundreds of jobs with that, I'll probably do that much more.
And I think HUD and transportation use apprenticeship in their procurement process, right? So there is some precedent, a little bit different.
I strongly suspect that the era of incentivizing federal contractors to do anything is probably over for at least the next 4 years.
Well, okay, so I'll speak to this because we have a grantee called Jobs to Move America that is doing really great work in this space. So what they do is they have worked with a number of transportation agencies, and they've developed what they call the U.S. Employment Plan, which gives companies credit for having apprenticeship programs when an agency needs to go buy rail cars or buses.
But that's at the state or local level.
That's at the state or local level, yeah. But we spend a lot of money at the state and local level.
Yeah.
So I think that is one sort of model for how you can use this kind of procurement in order to incentivize training programs and opportunities for underrepresented populations.
And to that end, the game is probably going to now be on procurement at the state and local level. So if you get the state and local level to agree that they're going to buy rail cars or something else, it's probably a very few number of companies that are providing those. So if you get them to do it for California and New York, you're probably going to get them to adopt this more broadly. That'll benefit Alabama, Massachusetts, and Wyoming too, right? So it's going to be less a federal procurement opportunity for a while than it will be at the state and local. That will have a broader trickle effect like in many other things.
Great. All right, one last call for questions, and then we're going to turn it back over to Bob and Tom to give some closing remarks. But you had one more question?
Last question, maybe a lower level question. I have I've been working with some local organizations in Washington because Washington is exploding in development and redevelopment.
Which Washington?
Washington State. Oh, this Washington.
This Washington. Okay.
And what it's exploding in actually is hospitality, restaurants, and entertainment, all that stuff. And we've been talking a lot about the possibility of paid work experience, which is it's a different terminology, and I think it may be. The question is whether it's a big cut between what we normally think of as apprenticeships and paid work experiences for a population that needs a variety of wraparound services and those sorts of things. So the question is whether it's very different. And also whether there is a more or less interest in the potential, in the employer's potential for taking this population. We're really struggling with generating an interest and a receptivity to employ populations that really need a variety of other services and a lot of remedial help. Although some of the employers that I've talked to who are successful in this actually can get people to work if they're interested in it and able to do it. They get people to come into jobs permanently within 3 months. You know, we have a paid work experience program in Washington, for instance, which is 9 months and minimum wage and so forth. And an employer who knows how to do this and somebody working along with them can get them employed and long term. Is this a totally different world than what you think of in terms of apprenticeships?
You know, I should mention, so the National Restaurant Association is one of the contract intermediaries in the most recent awards made by the Department of Labor, and I think they are looking at hospitality and industries like that. You know, I think that there is oftentimes in the U.S. confusion between paid internships and apprenticeships, and so I think, you know, we are trying to be really careful to define, and I think an apprenticeship it's more than just paid work experience. It's an education, it's a pathway, it's training, and so that leads to you know, a permanent placement. So it could be that some of those really would fit the criteria for apprenticeship and others wouldn't. But I think that with the National Restaurant Association serving as an intermediary, I think that's what they're looking to is, you know, how do we move these programs forward into being a full apprenticeship program? And so, you know, I'm happy that they're one of the contract intermediaries.
I think we really want to keep apprenticeship as that combination of work and learning that leads to a credential. And a paid work experience may not have the learning or the credential at the end in order to really respect and retain what an apprenticeship is and should be. And this is as much for the benefit of the employee as it is for the employer, right? And the value for the economy is to know that there is something there that you walk away with that is transferable and is portable and has value in the labor market, which a paid work experience may give you some of that, but how's the next employer going to know, and how do you demonstrate that other than to say I was, you know, working in the IHOP for a while?
Right, that's the value of the registered apprenticeship, so it's a nationally recognized credential. All right, so we'll wrap up, and I'll turn it back over to Tom and Bob.
Okay. Very quickly, I'm going to try and beat Abraham Lincoln's 272 words, so make this less than the Gettysburg Address. Just want to say a big thank you again to the Urban Institute and also to my colleagues that made the trip over from the United Kingdom this year. One of the things that's been great about coming here 12 months on is actually how much fantastic progress is being made here in the United States from the Department of Labor across the states with a whole bunch of folks that you heard today. I mean, some really fantastic contributions. So thanks to you. Just a final thing to say that TAFE is something that goes on all year round with our members. Just go to newworktraining.com, hit TAFE if you want to find out more. And I just want to extend this final invitation. Britain's National Apprenticeship Week is in March, first week of March next year. If anyone fancies coming over for that party, you're very, very welcome. Just like here, you're kind of getting to terms with a post-Trump world. You've got to come to terms with our post-Brexit Britain as well when you come over. But don't worry, guys, the sun will still be coming up in the morning. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm not going to be quite as brief as Tom, but I will be brief. Just want to make a couple of substantive points. The first point has to do with occupations and wages. And I once did a study to look at the gap in earnings between workers, all workers in America. And I asked the following question: How much of the gap in wages has to do with wage differences within very detailed occupations? And how much of it has to do with wage differences between occupations? And a huge amount has to do, more than 60% had to do with wage differences within occupations, meaning that if you could bring up people from lower levels of those occupations up to higher levels, whether it's police, whether it's a chef, whether it's a slitter operator, whether it's any of these kinds of jobs that we think of as, not great jobs, we would make tremendous progress. Number two, I think what we need is to publicize the graduation ceremonies of apprenticeships. And they exist, and they're very, very compelling. Once an employer who's skeptical about apprenticeship sees several of his workers graduate and in a ceremony and bringing their families and having shown that they've accomplished the requirements that have been demanding of an apprenticeship, they are moved. And they are moved about extending the apprenticeships to all the other people. We had an example, Carla had to leave, but in South Carolina, where a nursing home provider got several, here, Carla, you'll know about this. The nursing home provider got someone who's now head of your technical college system to develop apprenticeship in his nursing home system. And he said, well, let's try a pilot, because he had a lot of workers leaving very quickly and so on. He tried a pilot with I don't know how many workers, and when they graduated, he was so moved, he said, I want apprenticeship for all our entry workers. So it's getting them started is a huge, huge element. It was mentioned about information and publicity, and we need that vitally. But we need at the same time the providers like Franklin and other providers like the Washington High Tech Group. We need to have them have a place to call when they see these ads on TV, especially from the employer side. That particular ad was mainly for the young people going into apprenticeships. We need to have similar ones on the employer side. But as Tom said, just a final conclusion, we are making progress. We thank our friends from the UK for helping that progress move along. We hope to follow you in numbers and in quality. And thank you all for staying so late. We'll see you next time.